Good morning, everybody. I'm Tom Campbell. I'm the director of the Fine Art Museums. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce today a friend, a colleague, and a huge figure in the field of Tudor and indeed all architectural studies in Britain, Dr. Simon Thurley. Simon studied at the Courtauld Institute in London, where he wrote a PhD about Henry VIII's palaces, and from there, at an extraordinarily precocious age, he was hired as the director of the Historic Royal Palaces Agency, which was founded in part to undertake the restoration work at Hampton Court after the disastrous fire there in 1986. Simon headed up the restoration, which to a large part survives today if you visit Hampton Court, and then went on to work at other royal palaces open to the public, including, very significantly, Kensington Palace. In 1997, he left Historic Royal Palaces to become the director of the Museum of London, where he led an entire rethink of the display of the collections. And then in 2003, he became the head of English Heritage, which is the organization responsible for castles and historic monuments and sites around Britain. So they're a huge enterprise. Simon left that role in 2016, having essentially entirely reorganized English Heritage, and in 2021 was invited by the Prime Minister to head the National Heritage Memorial Fund, which is responsible for saving works of art for the British nation. If all of this wasn't enough, Simon is an extraordinarily productive scholar and writer. He has written numerous books about architecture in Britain, especially on the courts of the Tudor and Stuart courts. His books, Houses of Power, on the Tudor court, published in 2017, and Palaces of Revolution on the Stuart court, published in 2021. And we've just been joined by some royal personages. Are essentially the books on the subject, as is his book, The Building of England, about the architecture of Britain, which he is now revising for republication. On a personal note, Simon's career has been led by extraordinary kind of grounding of research, enthusiasm, and vision. And on a personal note, I well remember how, as a PhD student working on Henry VIII's Tapestries and thinking that perhaps nobody in the entire world was interested in this subject, I turned to Simon, who I was just getting to know at the time, and he said, "But Tom, that's incredibly interesting," and helped turn around my own enthusiasm, and for better or for worse, I ended up becoming an art historian. So it's an enormous pleasure to welcome friend and colleague Simon Thurley to the podium. Simon.
Tom, thank you very much, and Your Majesty, it's nice to have you with us today as well. And it's a great pleasure to come here, and I did see this show in New York, and I've just seen it again here, and it's a knockout show, and extraordinary that such a show has never been shown in England. So you're very lucky to have it here. Well, England in the 15th century was a bit of a disaster. For a century, nobody could resolve a fundamental problem, which was who was going to sit on the throne. There were two families, the family of Lancaster and the family of York, who were slogging it out between them. And at one point, one family had the throne, and another point, the other had the throne. And of course, this is memorialized by William Shakespeare, who recorded the fact that the Yorkist family was represented by the white rose and the Lancastrians by the red rose. And so he called this century of turmoil the Wars of the Roses. Well, in 1485, there was yet another battle between the seated king, who was King Richard III, and a claimant to the throne, who was an extremely obscure Welsh aristocrat. And at that battle, which you see a 19th century depiction of here on the screen, the obscure Welsh aristocrat, against all predictions, killed the King of England and took the throne. That Welsh aristocrat was called Henry Tudor. And nobody knew it at the time, but that battle was the beginning of the end of the Wars of the Roses. And this wonderful print, Elizabethan print, shows the merging of the red rose and the white rose in the person of the Tudor dynasty and the security that it brought. And amazingly, that victory in 1485 and the 15 years of consolidation afterwards meant that for 118 years the Tudors were on the throne of England. And this charming print shows Henry VIII on the throne and Queen Elizabeth and Edward VI and Queen Mary, the progeny of the victor of Bosworth. Well, in 1485, of course, people didn't have the benefit of hindsight, and they didn't know that this was indeed the last battle of the Civil War. And it actually took another 15 years, including a number of other battles, which Henry VII won, before he felt secure on the throne. But by the mid-1490s, he felt confident enough to start building himself some residences that he believed were suitable to his new position as King of England. The most important one of those, to him at least, was this building here, the Royal Manor of Richmond, which is built out to the west of London on the river, as you see. A palace that he named after one of his own titles, because he was the Duke of Richmond, and so his palace was called Richmond. And this was finished in the early 16th century and became one of the major royal residences throughout the Tudor period. He also invested in a palace to the east of London. This is at Greenwich, where he built another riverside residence, this one long, low building of brick against the river, which you see here in a 16th century drawing. So these two buildings became, in many ways, the centre of royal life, and it was at Greenwich where the heir to the throne and Henry VII's successor, Henry VIII, was born. Now, when he came to the throne in 1509, he was only 17 years old. And you will have all heard that Louis XIV of France was known as the Sun King. I think that Henry VIII at this point should have been known as the Fun King, because this teenage youth had become monarch of one of the most powerful countries in Europe. He was obsessed with hunting, his own prowess on a horse. He was warlike. He wanted to go to war and fight the French. He was obsessed with tales of chivalry, and he loved nothing more than being on his horse, jousting with his fellow teenagers. And for those that first part of his reign, he was effectively based here at Greenwich. And I pointed out the range here that was built by his father, but in the background here you can see a field set out for tournaments. This is the barrier down the middle, and the two horses would have charged each other from either end. And he built these towers here, which were for the ladies of the court to watch him and swoon with admiration as he knocked people off their horse. But Greenwich was very much set out as the fun palace for the fun king. And I'm going to show you here my plan of Greenwich. This is that range that you were looking at from the river. These are those towers you saw in the background. Here's the tilt yard. But what I want you to notice is that he builds a series of stables here for his jousting horses and his hunting horses. And he also builds, right next door to his palace, a factory for making armour. Because tilting required armour and going to war required armour. And after I've stopped speaking, you can go down and see some of the fabulous armours that were built in the armour factory at Greenwich Palace, constructed by Henry VIII. Now, a big moment in Henry VIII's life took place in 1529, when he finally realised that his wife, the Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon, was not going to give him a son, and in a moment of blinding conversion, realised that the problem wasn't his genetics or her genetics, it was in fact that he had displeased God by marrying a woman who had previously been married to his dead brother. And he used this as an excuse to divorce her and to marry his mistress, Anne Boleyn. Now, the reason that this is important is because Anne Boleyn really, and the divorce itself indeed, forced him to grow up. And turning away from the passions of his youth, he suddenly became obsessed with architecture. And Henry and Anne together embarked on two extraordinary building projects. The first was to build themselves a new major residence in the heart of London, at Westminster, a few hundred yards from the Houses of Parliament, and this was Whitehall Palace. And here you can see my reconstruction of the building, which has almost completely disappeared. It was a vast place. It covered 60 acres. And as you can see, it was also on the river. This is the River Thames here. His own private lodgings, his own private apartments were here. Here were the outer rooms. Here's the Great Hall, the chapel, and this is the entrance in from the street. So Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII embark on building this magnificent palace in the heart of London. They also set out to build a country residence, a new country residence out to the west, which turned out to be Hampton Court. This is Hampton Court today. This was all rebuilt in the 17th century, but all this here is part of Henry VIII's palace that he extended and embellished together with Anne. And here is, again, a reconstruction drawing showing what it was like. And both these palaces were not just residences, they were machines for government. Because rather like your own much beloved White House in Washington, these palaces were places where the executive lived and governed. And so when you look at Hampton Court, you can see all the components that were necessary for that to happen. This range here are the kitchens, where 400 people laboured to make not only the king's food, but the food for the courtiers. When the court's in residence, there are about 800 people living at Hampton Court, so it's a big place. You have the Great Hall, which is where they all ate communally. You have the chapel, which is extremely important because Tudor life revolved around church ceremonies. You have the outer chambers, which are where the foreign ambassadors were received. And then very importantly, you have the king's own private chambers, and his private gardens going down to the river. To develop these palaces, Henry VIII promoted a new breed of architects. We know their names, but we don't have a painting of any of them. However, I want to show you this very beautiful painting, which is in the show upstairs. This man, we don't know who he is, unfortunately, is wearing the royal livery of Henry VIII. That is the uniform that all senior court officials were required to wear. And Henry VIII's chief architects, who were the people who built Hampton Court and Whitehall, were required to wear this red uniform with the H's on it, which was their symbol of their belonging to the royal court. Now, the divorce from Catherine of Aragon wasn't only the divorce from a wife, it was the divorce from the entire apparatus of European Christendom, because to divorce his wife, he had to fall out with the Pope. And this sent England on a completely different religious trajectory from the rest of Europe. And one of the unintended and unexpected consequences of this was Henry VIII's decision to strip the church in England of its wealth. And he did that by, the technical term is dissolving the monasteries. There were hundreds and hundreds of monasteries, and taking money and goods and lands from the bishops. And here you see one of the great Cistercian monasteries of England that was ruined and gave up all its land, its treasures, its gold and silver to the king. What this meant was that suddenly, overnight, Henry VIII became the richest monarch to have ever sat on the English throne. And we know exactly how much money he took from the church because it's all written down in great big journals. And over the last 15 years of the reign, he grosses £1.3 million from the church. Now, to us, that probably doesn't sound like that much money. But the comparative figure you need to know is that the richest aristocrats in England were earning a year £2,000. So £1.3 million is a gigantic sum of money. And a very large part of that was ploughed into architecture, art, and architecture. So, probably £1 million between 1533 and 1547 was spent on buildings and on furnishing them. When he came to the throne in 1509, he inherited from Henry VII 20 houses. Now that seems like quite a lot of houses. But when he died in 1547, he owned 70. And this is a map here that shows the houses as they were distributed across England. Now, what on earth could anybody want with 70 houses? Well, royal life was very strictly governed by an annual round of movements. In the winter, the court was what I would describe as itinerant. In other words, it stayed in the Thames Valley, close to London, moving between just the very largest houses. So it would stay in Whitehall for a few weeks, then it would move to Hampton Court, then it would move to Greenwich, then it would move to Richmond. So it would be moving essentially on this little bit of the River Thames down here to these palaces. So that was winter life. In the summer, the king went on what was known as a progress, which is sort of like a summer holiday, but it was pretty arduous because he went out and stayed at a whole series of residences. And here you see a map showing the progress of 1526, when he travelled 300 miles, visiting those outlying palaces, those outlying 70 or so places, where he would hunt, he would meet local aristocrats, and he would have a very nice time. But I think the very important thing about this is that these palaces outside London were not kept furnished. They were essentially empty shells. They were kind of like a stage set. And so everything had to be taken with them in carts. And on that progress in 1526, there were 350 carts full of tapestries rolled up, furniture, all his clothing, bed linen, plate, knives, forks, spoons, glassware, ceramics. Everything had to be carried from palace to palace. Only 4 houses were kept fully furnished the whole time. And those were the houses in the Thames Valley in the centre of London, including Hampton Court, Greenwich, and Whitehall. So let's just have a look at how those buildings were in fact furnished. And this is kind of a diagram here, which shows how these royal palaces were organised. And you can see that they're divided into 3 bits. There were the outer rooms, which were very, very, very large, which were used for receiving people, and actually almost anybody respectably dressed and well-behaved could go into the Great Hall, the Watching Chamber, the Presence Chamber. Then there was the second area, which was called the Privy Chamber. Privy just means private. And there was a man standing at the door of the Privy Chamber, in this little gallery here, with almost literally a list. And if your name was on the list, you were allowed through. If it wasn't, you weren't allowed in. So this is a much more private zone. And then beyond that, there was another door between the withdrawing chamber and this area, which were called the secret lodgings. And these were the most private rooms in which the king lived. So you've got 3 sections, but you also have 3 hierarchies. And in decorative terms, and in terms of the things that were in those rooms, you go from a series of rooms where you have things that are big, perhaps slightly less valuable, and you go into the secret lodgings where you get the most valuable stuff of all. The outer rooms were primarily hung with tapestries. And Henry VIII was a great connoisseur of tapestry, and Tom is absolutely right. I do get very excited about tapestry, not perhaps quite as excited as him, but I do get very excited about it. And here is this astonishing tapestry that's on show upstairs. I mean, really quite amazing. It's been relatively recently discovered. And this was one of a set of 9, extremely valuable. Tom probably has got the precise cost of them, but they cost about £3,000 or so. Again, just to kind of give you an idea, I've already said £2,000 was the annual income of the richest earl. When you think that £1,500 would have bought you quite a good battleship, this set of tapestries is 2 battleships for the Navy. I mean, this is enormously valuable stuff. And Henry VIII has more than 2,500 tapestries in his collection, which are hanging in these outer rooms. But when you go into the Privy Chamber and into the secret lodgings, the rooms tend to be hung with silks, with velvet, and in the most important rooms with cloth of gold. And another completely astonishing object that is on show here at the moment is this textile. And when you go and have a look at it closely and you see the cut velvet and the solid gold thread that has been picked out so it would have shimmered in the candlelight, and you try and imagine an entire room hung with it, your mind begins to boggle. So these innermost rooms are hung with the richest fabrics. But it's not only textiles that grace these rooms. A drawing in the Louvre of one of the outer rooms at Whitehall Palace shows how the rooms were also panelled in carved timber, and there's some, again, upstairs there's some marvellous carved timber panelling that you can see. But also in this particular example, these stucco figures, these are made of plaster, moulded plaster, which adorned the upper walls. And of course, all the rooms were heated with fireplaces. And here is a design for a chimney piece by Hans Holbein the Younger, again, probably for Whitehall Palace. And you can see the magnificence, the size of the piece. The windows, full of stained glass. This is a piece in the Victoria and Albert Museum with the royal arms decorating the windows. Hardly an inch of any part of the interior of the Tudor palace was left alone. It was painted, it was covered in textiles, and there were some huge murals. And this is the most famous mural at Whitehall Palace. It was burnt when Whitehall Palace was burnt. This section here is the copy of it, which shows Henry, his father Henry VII, his mother Elizabeth of York, and Jane Seymour, the wife who produced his son and heir. And on the left-hand side, you see the cartoon from it, which is in the National Gallery in London. And you can see that famous image of Henry VIII with his hand, one hand by the dagger, the other hand sort of holding a pair of gloves at his waist, and his enormous codpiece thrusting out from his jerkin. Very important thing to emphasize, obviously. So that is just a very quick outline of what these palaces were like inside. But today, when we look at the things that are in this exhibition, we feel we're coming to an art show. We're looking at art. But what did the Tudors think of it? Well, they certainly didn't think of it as art, some sort of special category of making. So what was it that the Tudors really valued when they came to consider things that they were going to adorn their interiors with? Well, there were four things, I think. There were four ways in which they judged an object. And the first of those was costliness, its value. And that basically boiled down to how much gold, silver, pearls, diamonds, jewels, emeralds it had in it. And that is why when you go and see those remarkable tapestries upstairs, they are groaning with gold thread. The sheer quantity of precious metals was one of the things that they really, really valued. So that was the first thing they looked for. They looked for costliness. The second consideration they would look for is what they called cunning, which is skill. And here is an extraordinary object which was in the Met version of this show, which is a 15th century piece of porcelain, Chinese porcelain, which nobody in Europe could begin to produce anything that was remotely as sophisticated as this, covered with gold mounts, beautifully and incredibly skillfully made. This was an example of supreme cunning, supreme skill, and represented the second of the four things that the Tudors really loved. The third thing they loved was novelty. And there was a continuous quest to find things that were new, that were unusual, that people would look at and think, wow, gosh, look at that. And here is an example of a Tudor novelty, this amazing miniature of Henry VIII. This is an object that's sort of this big, incredible that you could paint a painting with a brush so fine that you can make it so realistic, set in a gold and enamel mount. Much value put on this for its novelty and unusualness. So we have costliness, we have cunning, we have novelty, and finally we have what they would have called placement. In other words, how you arrange your stuff. And here is a lovely drawing, a painting upstairs, and you can see here the way that Anthony Mildmay, a courtier, has thought about the colours and the placement of everything. Look at the blue trims on the tent and the blue plumes on his helm and the blue on the carpet and his sash. This is the coordination of all those beautiful things to create a wonderful work of art. Well, the Tudors' lust for costliness, cunning, novelty, and placement might seem to us, if we'd seen it all together, a little bit over the top and a little bit indigestible. We certainly would have felt that the meaning of minimalism had passed them by. But that was what they liked. Well, Henry VIII dies in 1547, and Elizabeth I, in due course, after a short reign of her brother Edward, comes to the throne, and this ravishing portrait here of Elizabeth shows her as a young woman. She inherits this vast number of houses from her father. By then, a few had been got rid of, but there's still more than 60 houses she inherits. She also inherits 2,700 tapestries, 640 carpets, 690 cushions, 97 bedsteads, 30 canopies of state. I could go on for hours and hours. These houses were crammed full of extraordinary, to us, works of art. But of course, what happens to Queen Elizabeth is that she is excommunicated by the Pope. She is the monarch of a Protestant nation, and the Pope regards her as a heretic, and in 1570 she is struck off, and any true Catholic who assassinated her would go straight to heaven. So it was worth it. And what you see in the background of this wonderful portrait of Elizabeth I is the beginnings of the Spanish Armada, the invasion fleet sent by the Spanish to conquer England and bring England back into the fold. But the effect of the excommunication effectively cuts England off from all the currents of cultural activity in mainland Europe. And England begins to turn in on itself, and Elizabethan art and design, culture, architecture and decoration is a unique thing, cut off from many of those strains. And so if you travel to England and look at any of the extraordinary Elizabethan houses, you see this almost sort of crazy architecture. Over the top, lots of carving, decoration, layer upon layer, and this absolutely wonderful object, one of the most beautiful piece of Tudor furniture to survive, is upstairs for you to see, and you can see some of that extraordinary sense of design encapsulated in this amazing carving. Well, Elizabeth the first dies without producing an heir, and with her death, the Tudor dynasty comes to an end. The throne goes to her cousin, who's the King of Scotland, James I, and he immediately, in 1604, makes peace with Spain, makes peace with Europe, and suddenly the doors to Europe are open. Jacobean courtiers can travel across Europe. The currents of cultural exchange are reopened. And it is the end of an era. It is the end of a distinctive chapter in artistic history. But a chapter, ladies and gentlemen, that extraordinarily you can enjoy here in San Francisco in the fantastic exhibition upstairs. Thank you.
Simon, thank you so much. That was a fabulous, rapid romp through Tudor art and style. So for the second half of our presentation this morning, I'm going to ask Simon a few questions, and then we'll throw it open to the audience. I've got a few slides on the deck which have some of the interiors, some of the tapestries that survive from this time. Behind Simon, you see this is the Great Hall at Hampton Court, hung with a rather extraordinary, the most extraordinary set of tapestries that Henry commissioned around 1540, paid for with, as we heard from Simon, this sort of huge wealth that came from the dissolution of the monasteries. And the Abraham tapestries, which are an amazing survival, because, as Simon said, the Royal Collection had 2,500 tapestries in it by the time Henry died. Many of relatively low value, but a couple of hundred, heavily woven with gold. And of all of them, the Abrahams were the most expensive, worth a king's fortune, because Abraham was a very resonant figure for Henry. He enjoyed a covenant with God that ensured the transition of his line and of his leadership from himself, Abraham, to his son, Isaac. And so this is a resonant comparison for Henry with the Tudor lineage from himself to his long-awaited heir, Edward. So I think it's a nice backdrop, Simon, for you. I'd like to start off, we've talked about the huge wealth that was spent on works of art, huge wealth spent on the palaces. What do we know about Henry's agency? Clearly, these buildings were built for him. These tapestries were purchased for him. But how much do we know about Henry as a patron? Was it all delegated when it comes to the architecture?
Well, we should perhaps start with the architecture, because before his divorce, his great desire really was to fight the French. Now, it's a totally understandable position to be in, actually, because the British have been fighting the French forever. But he still had a claim, quite a tenuous one, to the throne of France. And so, as a very young king, what he's really interested in is castles. And we know, because we have the evidence, that he would sit down with his military engineers and sketch out fortresses and forts that he would like to build. But it wasn't really until Anne Boleyn came on the scene that he became interested in domestic architecture. And there's a wonderful account of him and Anne in the summer of 1532. It's just before they get married, and they're just starting on rebuilding Whitehall, of going to Greenwich and summoning James Needham, who is the architect who's wearing that livery I showed you, and ordering big sheets of parchment, and together in a room sitting down sketching out the form of the palace. So Henry VIII is very, very involved in architectural design, absolutely. And there are lots of accounts of him turning up at a building site and shouting at the workmen, telling them to get on with it. Worse for them, changing his mind and wanting a wall moved sort of 3 foot over, so it all has to be demolished and moved over. So we know about that. I think that it is inconceivable, and this is your area of expertise, Tom, to imagine these phenomenally expensive commissions of tapestries and other items being done without his intimate involvement. I think that people very easily fall into a very sort of trite explanation of why monarchs have things like this. They all say, it's about expressing their power. Well, if you are fantastically rich, it is really good fun buying expensive things and going on amazingly extravagant shopping trips. And so, obviously, there was a component of representation, as Tom describes, of choosing the representation of Abraham. But actually, the sheer pleasure of commissioning something that nobody else in England could afford, and very few people in Europe could afford. So he was certainly involved.
Yeah. Yes, I think you referenced in your discussion of the decoration of the palaces and of the royal progresses, the huge numbers of carts sent off with all the royal possessions as the king went on progress. And I think that one of the things we forget today when we visit historic places like Hampton Court, you see things statically there, like wallpaper. And what we overlook is the theatricality. The fact you mentioned it was like a stage set. And when the court comes to town, the preparations that went into staging the monarchy.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And in a way, this is a very misleading picture because the Great Hall at Hampton Court was mainly used as a massive dining room for all the court servants. And in that condition, it certainly would not have had these tapestries on the wall. And these tapestries were only unrolled and hung on very, very special occasions. And most of the time, the walls in the hall were completely blank. And the king had a very important person in his privy chamber, which is his most intimate area of his palace, who was called the gentleman usher. And the gentleman usher was basically an interior decorator. And it was his job, as Tom says, to go ahead of the court and to set everything up. It would be interesting to know, we never can know, how many instructions were given to him by the king. I can imagine the king may well have said, oh, can you make sure when we go to New Hall in Essex, can you just make sure you take the such and such tapestries, because I'd really like to have them there. And that was the job of the gentleman usher and his assistants, to rush ahead of the king and do the interior decoration so that when the king turned up, it was all perfect.
Let's talk a little bit about style, because of course the first half of the 16th century is a period of extraordinary achievement in European art. We think about the great artists and the cult of individuality that develops in Italy around great artists like Leonardo, Raphael, Michelangelo. Of course, Britain, it has a very different heritage and aesthetic, but it is impacted during this era. And I remember, thinking of the textiles, that a lot of the old medieval textiles are kept at Windsor, including textiles and tapestries that have been plundered from the French 100 years before in battles in France. But of course, during this era, we're also seeing Henry acquiring works of art from leading continental artists. Could you talk perhaps first in architecture, how we see, or whether we don't see, continental stylistic developments impacting the framing, the style of the buildings?
Yes, when you try and look around today to see one of the buildings that were built by Henry VIII, you really struggle, I'm afraid, because most of them have been long replaced. But when you look at prints and drawings and paintings, and there are some upstairs in the exhibition, you look at the style in which they're built, and words begin to fail you, because it's very difficult to describe what it is you are actually seeing. You're clearly not seeing some sort of Renaissance building. You're not seeing a sort of Gothic building. You're actually seeing a building that I would describe as being very eclectic. In other words, a building that has elements and features in it that have been plundered from all sorts of places. And that really is the key to understanding the style in which the Tudors built. They took a little bit from Renaissance Italy, but they took quite a lot from the ideas of chivalry and castles. They were very influenced by biblical things. They were very interested in the sort of Temple of Solomon. And they put it all together in what, if you were being unkind, you might call a mishmash. But if you were being more sympathetic, as I would be, as a sort of carefully curated assemblage of elements that created a sort of fantasy architecture. And particularly when you go upstairs and look at the big blown-up picture of Nonsuch Palace, one of the king's later palaces, you can see that he was kind of creating a sort of fairy tale fantasy building. And it was a long time before Renaissance architecture came into England. In fact, you had to wait really until the 18th century before that actually had any impact.
Looking a little ahead to Elizabeth, we've talked about Henry and his intentionality as a patron, his enormous tastes, his overseeing the work. What about Elizabeth? I mean, she was a woman, a queen. There were plenty of people who didn't, if you want to forgive me, Your Grace, who were concerned that a woman would not survive long on the throne. So it was important for her to, in a sense, present herself on the stage that her father had created. What about her own tastes, her own commissions, architecture and otherwise?
Yeah, this is a really, really interesting area because the first issue architecturally she had to deal with was this sort of crazily large number of buildings, which was absolutely fine when the wealth of the church was being pumped into your coffers. But the moment Henry VIII died, in fact, actually really the moment her brother Edward VI died, that was that. There was no more money from the church. And Elizabethan England was no richer than England in the late 15th century when Henry VII had been on the throne. So just maintaining all these buildings was an absolute nightmare. So she gives away a lot of them. Some of them are demolished. Some of them she literally lets fall down. And so she doesn't do a lot of building. But what is interesting is that she has a very clear sense of what she does build is hers. And she puts her badge on it. And there's a little wing at Hampton Court, which has ER and a rose on it. There's one at Windsor Castle, which has ER and the date on it. So she has a very clear sense of what she is building and what she adds. But it's a very, very small area. The big thing that changes, and it's represented in your show, is the growth of easel painting and the way that images of her were reproduced en masse, not only for courtiers and loyalists in England, but as, in fact, a couple of the paintings in your show show, to be sent all over Europe to demonstrate who she was. So I think the big change I would characterize, it's the beginning of the rise of the importance of the portrait and the easel painting in terms of communicating to people who this person was, who this extraordinary woman was. And she kind of needed a narrative because she wasn't married, you know, and the whole of the Virgin Queen thing that came around that was popularized by this series of paintings, a couple of which you have upstairs.
And of course she gets her courtiers to build, almost in competition, all those incredible houses across the country.
Yeah, I mean, during Henry VIII's reign, the sort of architectural initiative, the leader of style was the king. Under Elizabeth, she is not the leader of architectural style. It goes to her courtiers. And you're absolutely right that she infinitely prefers to stay with her courtiers. It's much cheaper, much more comfortable. And when she is a young woman, they really want to have her to stay. But in the later years, particularly in the 1580s and 1590s, when she's incredibly bad-tempered and discourteous, and she intimates that she's going to come and stay, the excuses pour out. Oh, we can't. My child has got smallpox, or my dog is ill, or I'm afraid there's a hole in the roof, or every excuse is brought out because it was literally a ruinous experience. She would turn up with 600 people at your front door, and you were expected to put her up for a week in the style which she'd become accustomed, which, as we know, was quite grand. Yeah. So yes, the houses in the early part of the reign were built with the anticipation and the hope that she would come, but later on, the enthusiasm waned somewhat.
I want to get to questions from the audience, but let me ask one last question. You've worked very closely with the Royal Collection and with advisors to the Royal Collection. You've been responsible for the very significant renovation and representation of some of the royal palaces. We're at a watershed moment after the long reign of the second Queen Elizabeth. We're seeing a transition now to her son Charles. Do you anticipate significant changes in the heritage industry, in the royal palaces, in the way that the royal collections are shared with the public at this moment?
Well, history does repeat itself. The first Elizabeth reigned long and was a very old lady when she died. The second Elizabeth also did the same. And in both cases, there were heirs waiting. And James I, was born, literally born a king, and his whole life was anticipating inheriting from his cousin, and was waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting, for her to go. And I wouldn't say that King Charles III, as he is now, the former Prince of Wales, was waiting impatiently like James I was, but he has inherited palaces which have not really been touched for best part of 100 years. And major redecoration, reorganization of the Royal Collection is going on. And I live in Norfolk, which is somewhere you've never heard of, but it's just round the corner from the private country residence of the king. It's Sandringham House, it's called. And I went there only about 2 months after the Queen died, and already on the south front had sprung up this huge new garden, just out of nowhere, with full-grown trees all wheeled in. So I think there is going to be a very big change in the way the palaces look, and that's a good thing, I think.
Very exciting. Well, look, if we could have the house lights up now, and I'd love to take some questions from the audience.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, this may be out of your wheelhouse, but with William Shakespeare's reflection on the Tudors before and after Elizabeth.
How do you mean? That
Did Shakespeare's tone, speaking of history, change?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, well, of course, one of the things that people forget about William Shakespeare is that he was also a courtier. And just like Henry VIII's architects were given court liveries, William Shakespeare had a court livery. I mean, he turned up at court, and on the big occasions, he had to line up and shake hands with visiting ambassadors. So his version of history was very carefully curated, to address the issues of the day. And yes, he was absolutely a commentator on history, hugely influential in the way that history has subsequently been written, but he was also a propagandist. And his version of history cannot be trusted because it is absolutely a version that was the version that either Elizabeth or James wanted to hear.
Hi, my question is about the role of succession. You have Henry VIII, Edward, and then you have Mary Tudor, who, of course, marries a Spanish prince and is a Catholic queen. What would you say is her connection to the continent at this time, after her father led the dissolution of the monasteries?
So I think the thing that we need to remember about Henry VIII is that he was not a Protestant. Henry VIII believed in what was called the old religion. He was a religious traditionalist. And actually, there were all sorts of practices that were subsequently abolished under his son that he was very, very happy to continue with. It was under Edward VI and his guardians and the protectors that England moved rapidly towards Protestantism. And his reign was really quite short. And so Mary, who was next in line to the throne, was able really to slap the brakes on and put the car into reverse and start reversing quite rapidly. And it was a very, very tricky phase because there were lots of people who had gone along with Edward VI and suddenly, had to go back again to where they were. And of course, this today might seem to people in this room who might not have a faith or might not believe in God or Christianity, might just kind of seem like a theoretical thing. But it was not a theoretical thing. Your mortal soul actually depended on this. And so this flip-flopping between Protestantism and Catholicism was a real matter of conscience and crisis, which is why when Elizabeth comes to the throne, it was absolutely vital that she had to take a middle line. And she did it brilliantly. I mean, it was really her biggest and most important contribution, and one which still has echoes through the centuries to the religious settlement in the UK today, because weirdly, we still have an established church. King Charles III is the head of the church in England, which is a weird situation, but it still is the case. And Elizabeth's greatest achievement really was managing to bring the whole thing back onto even keel after this, as you rightly say, extraordinary situation that everybody faced.
When people were being burnt at the stake at the rate of at least one a week.
Yes.
Where's the microphone?
So you said Henry is kind of the fun king. Where did fun happen in these palaces? Did Hampton Court have libraries or art galleries, and how were those spaces decorated?
I don't think, certainly the young Henry VIII thought that either art galleries or libraries were much fun. And maybe that's the view of most teenagers. Looking around this room, I think that probably is a reasonable observation. So it mostly happened outside. Certainly in the summer months, there was a tremendous amount of hunting. Stag hunting was the sport of kings, literally. And those summer progresses I described were essentially these extraordinary hunting trips with huge packs of hounds. I mean, some of those carts contained his hounds. He had bloodhounds. He had all sorts of different types of hounds which were taken out for different hunting. The problem came in the winter. What do you do in the winter? Well, in the winter at Whitehall, he built 4 tennis courts, 2 indoor tennis courts, 2 outdoor tennis courts. There were 2 bowling alleys, and then there was a cockpit, which was an extraordinary building, actually probably about the size of this lecture theatre, with banked seats all the way round, and a stage in the middle, circular stage in the middle, where they staged cockfights. So the fun was tennis, bowls, cockfighting, playing cards, very keen on that, various other indoor games. Definitely masks and balls, lots of dancing, lots of playing music. But he was, like most monarchs in the 16th century, it was an outdoor life, and if he could be outdoors, he would be.
Why did you told us that during the wintertime they moved from house to house, castle to castle, and how difficult and arduous the moving was. Why did they move? Is it for government purposes, for entertainment? Why move from house to house?
Well, that's a really good question. So the winter movements of the court took place on the River Thames, because the roads were rutted and hopeless and you couldn't really take your carts on them. So you'd move by barge. You'd move between palaces that were fully furnished, so you didn't have to take everything with you. He kept a toothbrush in each of the houses, so he didn't have to pack his bags. But the reason they had to move is because you had 800 people living in a house where there were no vacuum cleaners, there were no flushing loos, there were no proper drains, and, block your ears because it's a bit indelicate. I mean, literally, the cesspits filled up and would have overflowed. And so it was essential that they had to move out so that they could clean the palace, make it spotless, and they could then move back again after a few weeks. And when you think the king himself would have had what was called a close stool, which is like a pot, which you sat on, but everybody else would have had a guardrobe, which was literally, there was a brick-lined pit with a sort of wooden plank with a hole on it, and you do your business there, and that brick-lined pit would fill up. And it was necessary for the kings, they were called the gong scourers, the gong was just a euphemism for a WC, to come in, empty them out, scrub them out, and make them clean for when the court next came. So it was a matter of hygiene, simple as that.
Could we have and then could we get the microphones down to the front as well?
You showed a bunch of artists from Henry VIII's reign being from the continent, like Hans Holbein. When Elizabeth was excommunicated, was that an opportunity for English artists and architects to kind of muscle in on some of the continental artists, or did the artists and architects remain from the continent?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes. There definitely was a opportunity. There were some Protestant nations where there was some artistic commerce backwards and forwards, but the great powers of Europe, particularly France and Spain, it was really impossible. Much of many of the currents of sort of Renaissance design were flowing through France and Spain, and England was cut off for those. But of course, there are wonderful, wonderful English painters in that period, some of which you can see upstairs, and people like Nicholas Hilliard, are extraordinarily talented and were, as you rightly say, able to come to the fore.
I've got my eyes on the clock, so we'll have 3 more questions.
What a wonderful compliment to the exhibit. Thank you so much. In terms of Tudor architecture, aside from Hampton Court Palace, could you suggest a number of other go-to places to see the best of, or the representative aspects of Tudor architecture?
Yes. Well, Hampton Court is a starting place. You then should go to Windsor Castle, and Windsor Castle is really amazing. It is still, absolutely main residence of the monarch, and you can still see the rooms in which Henry VII, Henry VIII, and Elizabeth were there. Many of them have been redecorated, but from the outside you can absolutely see. You can also see the sort of ecclesiastical works, because at Windsor there is the great chapel, which was also completed by the Tudors. I'd go to Eltham, which is in East London, where a great hall survives. Where else would you go? I mean,
Oxford and Cambridge, the colleges, give a wonderful sense of the contemporary architecture.
Yeah, Oxford and Cambridge, and in fact the Inns of Court probably off the Strand. So there are plenty. Actually, I've got a website which is royalpalaces.com. You have a look at that; it'll tell you what you can see.
Okay, so 3, 2.
With Henry's love of tapestries, did he attempt to establish any tapestry production in the UK, in Britain, importing perhaps Flemish artists, designers?
There was among the many workshops around the court, there was a workshop that was responsible for repairing the royal tapestries, run by a man called the Royal Arras Maker. And arras was the term they used for the gold-woven tapestries. And he had a fluctuating number of weavers working with him, 20 to 30 weavers. Most of the time they were repairing the royal tapestries, but there's some evidence that they were also making smaller tapestries. The challenge to making big tapestries was that it was a complex business. You needed huge input of finances to pay for the cost of the materials, to pay for the labor. A single tapestry could take 6 or 7 weavers 18 to 24 months to make, and that might have been one of a set of 10. So historically, tapestry, big, large-scale tapestry production has tended to be focused in cities where there was a combination of guilds supporting the labor force, very rich merchants who were investing in the industry, and the ancillary trades like dyers. And during the Tudor era, the big centres of tapestry production were Tournai, Brussels, Oudenarde, one or two other Flemish centres. They were like the Hollywood of the day. So you wouldn't, yes, there was some itinerant weaving, there was some small-scale weaving, table covers, cushions, small tapestries. But if you were one of the kings or one of the dukes, and you wanted really beautiful tapestries, you sent your agents to Antwerp. They would negotiate there with the Brussels weavers, and that's where the deals were struck. One more question.
Hello. So in working at some of these architectural sites, how do you decide where to draw the line between restoration versus conservation?
That's a very good question. Have you got the Great Watching Chamber there? Is that the next one or the previous one? So this is a room here in Hampton Court, which, when I was responsible for it, we did actually do some restoration of. So you can see the ceiling's all gilded. We know it was gilded in the time of Henry VIII. When I went to Hampton Court in the 80s, that ceiling had long had its gold all painted over. The timber work here had all gone. All this cornice here had gone. The panelling around here had gone. And the tapestries were just kind of hung on a wall like sort of postage stamps, and there was sort of no architecture. So we decided to replace the cornice, re-gild the ceiling. We actually replaced the floor as well. Now, it doesn't mean that when you go in there today, you're not looking at the authentic thing. I think you're looking at something that's more authentic, because the tapestries look really weird, if you remember what they looked like. They just, it didn't look good at all. And now they actually look as if they're part of the architecture, which they were always intended to be. So I think there are, this has been my whole life, really, in many ways, there are occasions when you do actually want to restore something to a previous, earlier state, but that should only be when it makes more sense of it to people. And it enables all the various parts to come together. And I think what we did in this room not only makes it a more beautiful room, but it makes sense of the way that the aesthetic worked in the 16th century between the tapestries and the architecture. So it's a good example of a room in which restoration, I think, was a good thing. I don't happen to have things on here of examples of bad ones. Obviously, there are bad ones that have happened over time, but I hope none of them were due to me.
Well, Simon, thank you so much for traveling to San Francisco. And thank you for sharing your expertise and your passion for this subject with us.